When I invite people to a liturgical worship service for the first time, usually when they're from a more non-denominational kind of background where they're not really used to, the historic liturgy and rituals and reciting things together and the clothing that the pastor or priest wears in front of the church, they are a little bit often confused, but also kind of put off. And I understand to some extent why that would be the case. People are put off by anything that's a little different from what they're used to. But one of the criticisms that I often hear as I bring people to a liturgical worship service for the first time is, well, it feels inauthentic. All of this ritual stuff that you've got going on, it all feels very empty. It doesn't feel like there's any authenticity, there isn't any heart, there isn't really any spirit in it. And I think that is a common criticism that we find not just in the church, but in the culture in general. Because in the modern era, and I've traced this out before in other videos that I've done dealing with the concept of authenticity and the individual self, and the nature of the self in relation to broader society and broader societal rituals, where you have this kind of pitting of the individual self and authenticity against the expectations of society. And the idea is that society, with all of its rules and all of its regulations and all of its expectations, really hinders you from being who you authentically are in terms of your inner autonomous individual self. So to truly be happy, to truly be free, you must kind of throw off the constraints of what is expected in society and find out who you really are apart from whatever society may or may not say. So I think this is an issue that happens in culture broadly, but it also certainly affects the church as well and how the church views worship. And this is true with anything in the church and developments throughout history. We have to recognize the important societal impacts upon the church in the ways that we think. So oftentimes we think we are simply being biblical, but in reality, we are all influenced by our own historical context and the ideas of our age. So it's something that we all have to just be self-aware of as we are evaluating things that we do. And I want to talk a little bit about the necessity of ritual in general. So I'm not just talking here about the church, I'm talking culturally, and I want to give an example of how this works in society. So the notion that we have today, that we have to be some kind of authentic self underneath ritual, that we need to throw off ritual, I want to kind of test that to say, do humans really do that? Do we really function in such a way that we can simply throw out societal conventions, we can simply throw out ritual, and live purely in spontaneity with no structure, say no societal structure, no hierarchical structures of who's in charge and who's not in charge? Well, if you think about a movement that was popular in the latter part of the 20th century that tried to throw off societal structures, you may think of something like the punk rock movement. Now, I was really involved in the punk rock community, the punk rock movement when I was a teenager. I went to punk shows regularly. I had the look. I had my spiked hair and leather jacket and punk band patches, and I still listen to some of the music because it's still kind of something that I do enjoy. It's part of my young years, but when you look at the punk rock community, punk rock was founded as this kind of anti-establishment movement. It was a youth movement, started in, New York City and the UK. There's debate about who was first, but, not to argue about that. But it's generally agreed upon that it was the mid-70s, 1975, 76, that the punk rock community started and rebelled against a lot of kind of what was expected, especially for young adults. And people didn't want to kind of live their parents' dream. And they started this subculture, the subculture of rebellion, and which led to, a subculture of anarchy, anarchy in the UK, but which is really just more of a rebellious song, I suppose. But then this actually became real, anarchist movements within punk rock as you get into crust punk and various anarcho-punk groups later on. But what I find interesting is that movement, which is so kind of anti-pressure from society, which is anti-mainstream society, became so ritualized in and of itself. So as someone who was part of this punk rock community as a teenager, I've kind of thought back on this in many ways and thought about how ritualized punk rock is, and how there are really structures all over the punk rock community. So, for example, when you start listening to punk rock music, you have a bit of an initiation phase, because usually you start listening to the bands that are more well-known, not bands that are not quite as, obscure. So you first maybe start listening to Green Day and Blink-182 and pop punk bands. And then maybe from there you start listening to bands like, Rancid or, The Clash or the Ramones or some of these bands. And when you do that, you start to join the community, you start to talk to people who are into that music. When you wear those shirts and people ask you what bands you like, people start labeling you a poser. You're a poser because you only know the basic bands, like the mainstream stuff. You're not really cool. You don't really know anything yet. And essentially what you need is someone in that group to kind of take you on and say, let me show you the real punk bands. And then you start listening to more punk bands. You get into street punk. And then perhaps as you kind of move on, there really is a hierarchy within punk rock, where the more obscure bands that you know, the kind of more punk rock you really are. And the older you get, the more, in some ways, the worse quality the music gets, because you kind of get to this point where you're just listening to these obscure 80s Finnish punk rock bands that have like terrible recording quality, but nobody else knows these bands, but you have everything on vinyl that these bands have ever recorded, and you kind of, when you go to a punk show, you see people with patches and pins of various bands, on their jackets, and there is automatically a hierarchy that's created by observing those people and figuring out what bands do they have on their jackets and how mainstream are those bands. And I find it so interesting that this is a community that tries to shun anything that is formalized or ritual of mainstream society, but it just creates its own hierarchy, because that's what every subculture does. So you also have then uniforms, and your uniform displays what kind of punk you are. Because if you are a street punk and you listen to that kind of music, you probably have, maybe dyed spiked hair or a mohawk. You have probably very tight pants, some combat boots, a jacket with studs on it. If you're maybe more into the kind of straight edge hardcore kind of scene, you probably wear, maybe gym shorts and band t-shirts with X's on your hands. Or if you are maybe more into, emo music, and I'm not talking about the My Chemical Romance stuff here, but, there's a certain look that you would have. And this is true of all the different various kinds of subgenres. So and this is just what clothing does in general, is you display something about yourself through what you wear. You are communicating to other people. I communicate to somebody, I like street punk. I communicate to somebody, I am someone who's into really obscure bands. I am somebody who's into skateboarding. This is simply what we do as creatures. And so we have, hierarchies in terms of structures. We have initiation rituals into the community. You learn different kinds of moshing or, two-stepping or different kinds of dances, depending on what kind of music you are into. These are communal rituals that you participate in together. When you get a group of people that are, punk rock together at a show, there are certain things that everybody does. There are certain phrases and words that everybody uses. You'll notice that, I remember being a teenager and just noticing how my friends all acted different when they were at a show than when we were just hanging out, because you try to kind of be cool, right? This is what everybody does. But you're in that group now and you're like, I have to impress people, so I have to talk a certain way. I have to use certain language. I have to kind of maybe poke fun at the posers, those people, so that I can feel like I am more part of the group than other people are. And you have your chants, you have your oi, oi, oi that you yell at a show. Because the things that people associate with dry, say, liturgical worship that I began this video talking about are really just things that define who we are as humans. We can't escape ritual. We cannot escape hierarchies. We cannot escape structure. We cannot escape initiation rituals. These are just how people are. And so even when you get a bunch of teenage people together, teenagers who are totally unrooted, trying to make their own culture, they naturally put their own rituals together. So the question really for us shouldn't be, is there this kind of dichotomy between ritual and authenticity, but instead say we are ritual creatures. But the question is, what rituals do we use? Do we express that which is good through our rituals? Do we express that which is tied to history through our rituals? Or do we just kind of pretend we don't have them and then just create our own anyway that are totally unrooted from history? So I know that people kind of think it's very odd for me in a lot of ways, moving from this kind of punk rock, and again, I still like punk music in a lot of ways, but from this punk rock teenage years to kind of where I am today, where I'm a proponent of, liturgical worship, classic menswear. I read books on etiquette. And the reason is that I think those things are not actually that opposed to one another is because really it's the fulfillment of a desire that is inherent in each of us to have identity and structure and ways of communicating, ways of dealing with other people. So I would rather do that, I think, in ways that are actually historically rooted and in ways that are good and beautiful and promote truth, goodness, and beauty. And I think that we can do that in our worship, but also just in how we interact with one another socially. So this is just something that I think about. I've addressed it kind of in passing at various points in different podcasts and videos that I've done, but I thought I'd spend a little bit of time just talking about it specifically here. So make sure you do subscribe to the channel if you have not already. I know a lot of you watch this and aren't actually subscribed, so we're almost at the 30,000 mark. I really want to hit that, so please help do that, and we'll see you in the next video. God bless.